welcome to our last Naturalist Night our last Naturalist Night of the series for 2018. My name is Sarah Johnson, and I represent the Wilderness Workshop, and along with the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies and the Roaring Fork Audubon, this speaker series goes on every winter for 10 weeks. These talks have been happening in Carbondale on Wednesdays, and they happen on Thursday evenings in Aspen at 7 p.m. If for some reason you're never or unable to come to a Naturalist Nights, we've been filming all of them, and they are all available on both the ACES and Wilderness Workshop websites, and they're high quality films because they're done by Grassroots TV. And so if you've missed some of them, they've been fantastic this year. They're all on our websites, so you can find some late night entertainment on YouTube on our websites. In order to make that happen, to pay for all of that, we have all these incredible sponsors. It takes a village to make this free speaker series happen. So if you happen to be an owner or involved with any of these businesses, we are greatly appreciative and thank you. And if you happen to know any people involved with these businesses, please make sure to tell them thank you. We have a featured sponsor tonight is Blazing Adventures. And so they've been in the community a long time, and we're especially grateful for them. We also appreciate everybody signing in on the clipboard over by the door. So thanks for doing that. It helps us keep track of things and keep track of numbers. And we also, if you're not already aware, we have a continuing education clipboard over there. So if you need any hours for continuing education, please sign that and ask me if you have any questions. As I said, this is the last of 10. So we have no introduction for next week's speaker series. We might just have to get together and eat cookies somewhere else. But thank you for all of you who keep coming and have been part of this community building project. It's a pleasure and an honor to get to be able to be the coordinator and host of it. So tonight we're really lucky. We have Dr. Jayne Belnap with us this evening, and she is the foremost authority on desert ecosystems, particularly the Colorado Plateau. She's lived in Moab for a very long time, and she's currently the USGS, or U.S. Geological Survey research ecologist. And she has spent the last 30 years studying soils, vegetation, and the impacts of past and current climates and disturbances in these desert ecosystems. Her most recent studies have focused on the impact of dust on regional water supplies. I'm not sure how much dust is out there on Mount Sopris. It's pretty windy here recently, so I need to see what's out there, if any. And she has also used past plant distributions to predict future vegetation patterns. Also, in her most recent work, in the past 5 years, she goes down to Antarctica once a year, spends at least a month or more, and she's working on mapping the soils down there in the dry valleys or the deserts in Antarctica. And it's quite interesting because she was telling me earlier about it, but it's all about doing proactive work before the tourists show up, as opposed to maybe where we are, where we're trying to figure out what to do with desert soils after the tourists show up. So it's fascinating. So it's just a big honor to be able to welcome you to our 2018 Naturalist Night series. And a lot of people here have come because they know of you. And I bet they're going to have good questions for you, too. So thank you, Jayne.
Now, as usual, I'm not talking about what my title says, but it approximates it. I thought what I would do is focus on biological soil crusts, because that's normally what people are the least informed about. And then in that context, we'll be talking about what's going to happen to plants and animals and dust and all that. So I won't completely mess with the title. But my new title is way cuter.
Okay.
Maybe.
Oh, goodness.
Get rid of that, would you? Is beauty just skin deep? Like, i.e., are soil crusts really like the rockers of the desert universe? And of course, the answer is yes. So I will kind of ruin the story by telling you that in the beginning. Okay, so while she's figuring that out, oh, she already figured it out? No, yes, no. So what are biocrusts? And I'll call them biocrusts. And so basically they're mosses and lichens, woohoo, and cyanobacteria. So there's a microbial component. It's cyanobacteria and fungi. Then there's lichens, and they're kind of the cake. So they're weaving through the soil surface. They're the fibers that hold the whole place together in deserts. And then on top come the mosses and the lichens. And the different kinds of proportions that happen with these organisms determine the ecosystem roles. So they're very different. So if you're in a really, really dry, hot desert, they're going to act differently than if you're in a cooler desert or something like this where it's even a little cooler. What I'm not talking about are physical crusts, and this is really important, because if you talk to a soil scientist and you say soil crust, they'll go, oh, those are really bad. And they are, because they basically seal the soil surface, and they're caused by trampling of animals. They're caused by lots of raindrops hitting soils and breaking up the soil aggregates, and so then the water doesn't infiltrate, it just runs off. Seedlings can't germinate in it. I mean, it really is a whole different thing. So you have to be very careful that you're not talking about physical crust when you say soil crust. Now, I'm going to get really sloppy in my language, and I'm going to say soil crust all the time, but I am not talking about physical crust. So where do these guys occur? They're everywhere that their light can reach the soil surface. So that means deserts and drylands for sure, because the plants are really far apart. Even in the Great Basin, sagebrush, it's still this far apart. So the light can reach the soil surface, so they're going to be there. They're in surprising systems that you wouldn't think of, like pine barrens in the southeast of the U.S., because again, the soils are real infertile. The trees grow really far apart, so light can reach the soil surface. So basically, where they're dominant is about 40% of the U.S., but like I said, there's all these other little pockets. And think about the tundra. There's like no plants there. When you get way up, it's all soil crust. Go up north to like Barrow, Alaska, it's all soil crust. So they're just really a predominant element in many, many ecosystems. They're in some surprising places. They're in Alaska, they're in Mongolia, they're in the Serengeti. There's all these places you just wouldn't think about having soil crust there. But again, the light can reach the soil surface. They're going to be there. So globally, they're about 45% of systems. So they're just this huge, ubiquitous component in all these places. And we know very little about them. Well, we did 30 years ago. Now we know a whole ton about them. I literally, 30 years ago, could not have spent 15 minutes without just kind of, not completing sentences and things, because I had nothing to say. In the last 30 years, we've learned a phenomenal amount, these guys. And so now I can talk for hours and hours and hours, and that's really awesome. So, and here's some of the surprising habitats. This is the Miombo woodlands in Zimbabwe, all the way to, it's just really amazing where you find them that you wouldn't expect. So these guys, I talked about how ecosystem roles are going to change depending on the proportion of those three main components. In dry deserts, you only get cyanobacteria. You don't get any frost heaving of the soil, so the soils don't freeze, they don't bump up, so they're really flat, and there's just cyanos, and so the ecosystem service there is going to be very different than like the Colorado Plateau, where they get really, really bumpy, and we got a lot of lichens. You get up to like southern Idaho, it's a carpet of lichens, and those are all going to act super differently. And the reason mostly is because of that texture on the soil, the morphology on the soil surface. So again, you get really flat stuff in a hyper-arid desert. It starts to rain a little more, like the Sonoran and some mosses and lichens come in, so it's a little roughened. You get, where we are in the Colorado Plateau, you got these pinnacles that are like 10 inches tall. And then you've got, when you get up to that southern Idaho stuff, you get so many mosses and lichens it can't bump up that same way. It's just too heavy. And so it'll go up a little bit, but it's kind of rolly. It's not really bumpy. But that really matters in terms of, is it going to capture resources? Okay, pretend like you're a drop of water trying to move across a surface that's covered with bumps that are 10 inches tall. You're not going to get anywhere, compared to something that's flat and it can just sheet off. So it's really, really different. You can't say biocrust do this or that, because they're different everywhere you go. So the living part of the biocrust are right at the surface. We're talking about the top millimeter or the top 2 millimeters. So it's tiny, tiny, tiny. This is the bad news, because that means that they're really susceptible to being squished or being blown away or washed away or whatever when they're disturbed, because you're just talking about that very surface. So they don't have anything underneath to kind of replenish them, and that's because they all are photosynthetic, so they have to get light, and if they get buried, they die. So that's the good and the bad. You know, they're really helping us protect those soil surface from wind erosion and water erosion, all these things, but the bad news is they're right at the surface, and so we can lose them quite easily. So what do these guys do for us? Awesome amounts. First of all, they're very, very important in capturing resources. So like I said, and now I'm going to talk about Colorado Plateau crusts and not the hot desert crusts. So now I'm going to get sloppy again. So I'm just going to say they do this and that, but I'm talking about here. They're really roughing the soil surface. So they're going to capture seeds and plant litter and water and everything that would want to leave that place. They're going to hold on to it. They're going to keep it there. So they contribute to soil fertility in that way, because you're going to get more water, you're going to get more plant nutrients, you're going to have more plants growing there, and it's because they're not going to let that stuff leave. If something's not capturing it, it's going to end up in the Colorado River, basically. It's going to take a long time to get there, but it'll get there. So they really keep things local, and that's awesome, good news for us. They also capture dust. Now, you've heard that dust is bad, dust can be good. And dust over thousands and thousands of years has just sprinkled down, not like we're getting these days, but little bits have been sprinkling down and basically adding fertility to desert soils that are more or less just sand grains. And if any of you are gardeners, you know that trying to grow plants in just sand grains is a pretty dismal business, because there's no fertility in there. There's no nitrogen, there's no phosphorus, there's none of the things the plants need. And that's all coming in from dust, and has for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I'll talk about dust and how the deposition has accelerated due to human activities. That's when it becomes a bad news story. But basically, the soil crusts are very good at capturing dust over all this time, and that's been critical for increasing the fertility of these soils. They also are able to take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it so that plants can use it. So when you eat plants and animals, you're not eating them for anything other than their nitrogen, basically. That's what you're after. Well, nitrogen is very, very limited in desert soils, because the big source of nitrogen is lightning. Lightning fixes, it's what we called when you can do that conversion. It fixes the nitrogen in the air, and then when it rains, it washes out. But guess what doesn't happen in deserts? Rain. So we don't get that nitrogen coming from rain. We get it from these guys. And the biocrusts are really, literally the source of nitrogen for desert ecosystems. So it's a big, big, big player in keeping those soils fertile. And we're just doing this study right now, and it's super, super cool, but it turns out there is a direct link between the soil crust, like a meter away, and a plant. So I can add nitrogen in that space a meter away, 24 hours later, it's in that plant. So, and it's not via the roots, it's via fungi. And they're just going, and it's landing right over there, like instantly. And so they've got this thing to, so it's kind of like you've been hearing, I think, about mushrooms and how the fungi are linking the different big trees and forests, and they're sharing nutrients and stuff. These guys are doing it here too. And so this is super exciting, because the implication is these desert plants are very, very dependent on the nitrogen that's being fixed by these guys. Soil crusts, because they also can do the same thing with carbon. So you got all this carbon in the atmosphere, same problem. You can't use it unless a plant converts it into biomass, or the soil crust convert it into some sort of biomass. Well, all the bugs living in the soil love carbon. They can't make it. They're not photosynthetic. They're dependent on the soil crust and the plants for their carbon. So when you have a really nice soil crust, you have way more bugs in the soil, and those guys are doing us all the great service of breaking down plant litter and making the nutrients tied up in that plant litter available again for plants. And so it's very important to have these guys to keep the plant litter, keep those nutrients moving through that system. Otherwise, they're going to be tied up in litter and sit there forever and everybody's going to be not happy. The other thing soil crusts do is they darken the soil surface. So this is a bunch of plots we did in one of the national parks near you. They wouldn't let me do this ever again. But 30 years ago, they're like, fine, do it. And we've now stopped doing this, and we're watching it recover. But the news is that it's really dark. Well, if it's really dark, that means two things. One is the sunlight's coming down, and the energy is being absorbed. It's not being reflected. If you have energy reflecting off of a surface like this, that is going to be dry, hot air. When that dry, hot air rises, it doesn't make clouds. It's dry and hot. And in fact, it pushes clouds away. So you can affect regional rainfall by having lots of light surfaces instead of what used to be a dark surface. So that's one huge implication for regional rainfall patterns. You don't want to have light surfaces like that. At that site, if you're a little bug and a beetle that used to know how to burrow to get out of the different temperatures and out of the different rainfall, you've now changed everything. It's about 15 degrees cooler in that light spot than it is in that dark spot. And so because these guys have very, very tight burrowing abilities. And so we're now taking them out of the zone of where they're really good at being. And there is not available anymore the place they're looking, and that's to be that certain degree of temperature. And then thirdly, plants grow in the spring here. And they want warm soils because spring is when everything is growing. The faster the warmer the soil, the faster they'll grow. The whole idea is to grow while there's water, right? And you want the air cool because you don't want to lose your water too fast. So you really want to have warm soils, not cold soils. And you have much colder soils when you stomp out the soil crust. So there's lots of reasons from just the temperature and that energy absorbing that you don't want to. And in fact, we did a little modeling exercise and showed that we actually can change global cycles by smashing out all the soil crusts around the world, which may seem unrealistic, but we've almost done it. So it's not unrealistic at all. Together, the news is that soil crusts really do make plants more delicious and nutritious, and they grow a lot faster and they grow a lot bigger. And we've done this experiment in the lab, and we've done this experiment in the field, and we've done it over and over again, and we keep getting the same answer. That pot over there is not an unusual one that's growing in a really nice soil crust. That plant's big, and it's got way more nitrogen than the plant that's growing in bare soil. Again, because they fix nitrogen and they fix carbon, and so there's all these reasons that they should be bigger and happier and more nutritious. If you're an animal to come along and eat that plant, you're going to get a lot more nitrogen. Just like I said, we all want nitrogen. We're not after like vitamins and stuff. That's buoy. What you want is your nitrogen. And so anybody who's eating plants growing in crusts are going to get way more nitrogen for that energy expended to get that bite. The other thing soil crusts can do for you is keep out exotic plants like cheatgrass. That's the good news. The bad news is, well, let me continue with the good news. It's mostly mechanical. Those big seeds have a really hard time getting down into a well-developed crust. They're going to have to find a little hole like that. They're not going to be able to just germinate on the surface like that. The air's too dry. They dry out too fast. And so they've got to find a little hole. That's really hard to do. The bad news is, remember, these guys fix nitrogen. They contribute to soil fertility. So if you break them up, guess what the cheatgrass seed just landed in? Much greater fertility. So if you break it up, they go gangbusters. So the good news is, if you leave it alone, you've got some protection. The bad news is, if you bust it up, you're like toast. So you don't want to do that. The other topic about soil crusts, and the big reason we should really love them, is soil stability. So these guys are very, very important in stabilizing soils. And it's not just now. The geologists have figured out that it was probably these same organisms that kept soils intact on early Earth. So here you got this ball. There's no plants yet. You've got stuff coming out of the rocks are weathering and making soil. But you got these huge winds, right? You have nothing that's going to keep the soils in place, or those little grains that are trying to make soils, because you don't have any plants to slow the wind down. You don't have any buildings. You don't have any trees. you don't have anything. And so the idea is that the cyanobacteria that lived in the ocean, which are the same guys as these, crawled onto land and started stabilizing these soils, created the pockets so that plants had a place to grow. So A, you owe them that because they've like helped you have a planet to live on. B, the guys in the ocean are the ones that created enough oxygen so we had an atmosphere to breathe. So you owe them for that. So we're getting a pretty hardcore list here of how you owe them everything that you can imagine. They also help weather rocks. So they secrete acids when they're sitting there, and they hold the soil down next to the rock, and they hold water in next to the rock, so everything just happens faster. So they've also accelerated weathering on Earth by about 10 times. So they are a very good package for that reason too. Current day soil stability, they are critical because again, we are in a place where the plants grow way, way apart. Well, there's nothing in between to stabilize the surfaces if you don't have these guys. And these guys are there, they're doing the job for you 24/7. You don't have to feed them, you don't have to anything, you just have to not step on them. And so they've got, these hugely steep slopes, they're held in place. You've got these soils in between the shrubs, they're held in place. Everything is phenomenally stable. Deserts are not naturally dusty places. I'm here to tell you, they're very stable unless you drive on them or walk on them or put cows on them or dogs on them or whatever it is. But they're very, very stable places. And it blew me away. I have this little wind tunnel, and I drove all around the West and I put the thing out, and it just really amazed me how much I didn't get off of a desert surface until I drove my car on it, which I then did and, blew the tunnel again, and I was like, whoa, it's a huge difference. Why do they do this, or how can they do this? It's because of all these little fibers. These guys, here's the cyanobacterial fibers going from sand grain to sand grain. They actually connect to the sand grain, and then they connect again in balls, and then those balls get connected to the point the wind and the water just can't move them. They're just too big and they're glued. And so the strings are just like, but nothing goes anywhere, as long as you've got a nice, well-developed crust. The bad news is these guys are kind of like a Corvette. So Corvette's fiberglass does great until it hits that wall. And then, it has no compressional strength whatsoever, right? It just crumbles. And that's exactly these guys. They've got phenomenal shear strength. They're really strong this way, but you step on them, they're just going to smash. So that's, again, the good news and the bad news. And then you can literally pick loose grain sand up because they hold it together so well. It's like felt. It's phenomenal. Okay, then you do things to them. You get kind of carried away, and we got lots of energy exploration going on now and development. We got off-road vehicles, luckily, are being constrained mostly to trails and roads now. We still have a lot of grazing in a lot of systems, but frankly, the grazing stabilized. It's decreased hugely since the 30s, and now it's pretty stable. But now we're seeing these other uses come in on top, especially recreation, which has gone pretty bonkers, as you guys well know. Moab's up to 2 million visitors a year now to our town of 6,000. And you're like, okay. It's kind of like new and novel. When you disturb them, now you've lost your stability, right? Because you just smashed all those connections. And you've lost your stability with water erosion and wind. So this is water, and we basically put a bunch of silt fences at the bottom. That stuff they use on constructions on highways that collects, it keeps the silt from entering the stream. So we went, great. So we stuck them at the bottom of these hill slopes. Then we stomped half of the hill slope, and we left the other half intact, and saw how much sediment we got off of it. And you can see if we stomp it, we get a huge increase in the sediment that's coming off those hill slopes. And so that's just us going one thing at, one footprint at a time. So it's like someone stepped on a place twice, actually. So it's not like major trumpage. It's just 2 passes.
So is that grain size on the bottom axis?
Yeah, we did it in both clay soils and sandy soils, and we got pretty much the same answer. There was this guy that was a humongo, but You know, it's not that much more than the 88. So it's pretty similar. So it's pretty much any soil type it's going to happen. Wind, we know, is a big deal. Dust is not just the Dust Bowl. It's certainly happening now. We're getting these major storms. That was one that happened not very long ago in Phoenix. This is Lubbock, Texas. This is one amazing. This happened in Central Valley of California. That's in 24 hours. They lost 3 feet of soil. Wow. So this plant was, you know, had soil right up to here, and it was just like, boosh, gone. So, I mean, it's really, and that was, I think, 20 years ago. But, I mean, the point is, dust storms were not just the Dust Bowl. Dust storms are happening now, and they're happening with regularity. And, in fact, this dust storm here in Phoenix made it to Moab to the point that we had a fatality on I-70 that was still so thick, and it had come all the way from Phoenix. And it still had so much power and so much dust in it that it was just apocalyptic trying to drive.
Is that what they call a haboob?
That was a haboob. So a haboob is a special kind of dust storm. It's got, oh, I forgot to tell you, if you have questions, just ask them. Oh, that's right. Okay, don't ask questions. A haboob is a special kind of dust storm because you get this phenomenally powerful downward wind. And most dust storms are just kind of, you know, blowing along, blah, 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 blah. But these guys get this boosh, and it hits the soil surface and just blasts it to smithereens. And so they grow as they go. They're not like a typical thing where you just kind of blow out. They actually get bigger as they travel. And then they finally get somewhere to some huge obstruction, i.e. the mountains, and that calms them down. But until they get to a mountain like that, they're just going to grow as they go. We know that there's lots of problems with dust. This was that dust storm in Moab that came from Phoenix. And I drove into that. It was one of the stupidest things I've ever done in my life. But I could see the other side of it. I'm like, oh, it's like, you know, a 4-minute drive. And I got into it, and I was like, because you can't see anything. I didn't know how to pull over because I couldn't see the road. I didn't know whether to slow down because I was going to get rear-ended. I didn't know whether to keep going because I was going to rear-end someone. I mean, it was just apocalyptic. I was like, wah! Nobody killed me, obviously. And then this is outside my Beijing hotel window in 2001. Where they'd had a dust storm. It's dust. And it had come from the Gobi. But just think if you were running a machine in that. You know, it was like this thin of nice, loosey dust. So, you know, it's going to get in every crack and crevice. It's going to get in every engine and ruin it. It's got huge economic impacts. That's also what you're breathing. And that's way less than the size for not respirable particles. So it's definitely implicated in all sorts of things, valley fever, asthma, cancer, all the other respiratory distresses, because all you need are these particles to get embedded in your lungs, and these are way smaller than the nose hairs are going to keep out. So there's
dust in the Antarctic?
No, but it's there.
You don't see it though?
Well, yes and no. Ask me when we have the microphone, because I don't get to answer you. But remind me, don't forget.
I won't. Thank you.
Okay, and then dust on snow. And you guys know about dust on snow because you get it. And here it is. And I got some awesome pictures of Aspen orange. The sky is orange. The snow is orange. It's really cool. And you know it's coming from us because our soil's orange. And actually, my dust traps, I collected Mongolian dust once. It was gray. It was really cool. Anyway, so the news is the dust inputs have increased hugely. So this is where, over here, where dust is a good thing. It helps fertilize soils. This is where it's a way bad thing because now it's just smothering things. And that's basically probably the livestock hitting the West. And it happened very quickly that we saw these huge increases. And then when the livestock started, they died off because of drought and cold. And then they put the Taylor Grazing Act in, and it kind of stabilized. That's the good news, but it did stabilize. You know, it's still way higher than it used to be. But the bad news is it's now unstabilizing and increasing again. And that's probably the recreation and the energy and all the other things that we're doing instead of using livestock. The other thing is that soil fertility because dust carries nutrients. So now we're taking the nutrients from the desert soils where we really need them and we're moving them up to the lakes where we don't want them. Because now we're fertilizing the lakes, and that's going to shift the whole soil food webs and everything about the lake ecosystems. So this is really bad news. So this is basically that same time frame. Here comes the nutrients, bam, and we're getting way, way more in these alpine lakes. So what happens that we care about this is that regional water supply story. That everyone knows that we're now getting, the snow is melting way earlier than it used to. It depends on the amount of dust. So in a not so dusty years, there's not that big of an impact, but in a really dusty year, you can get almost 2 months earlier that you've lost your snow. So why do we care other than if you're a skier or a ski resort owner? One is that reservoir managers are freaking out because they have got these algorithms that they have developed over years about how much water to let out of their reservoir when. So here's the dilemma, right? You want to fill it up, but if you get a slug of water coming down, you're going to breach your dam. Bad juju. But if you let too much water through, then you haven't stored the water that you need for later in the year. So it's always this, like, what do I do? But they pretty well had it figured out until all of a sudden they're getting these huge slugs of water earlier, months earlier than they used to get, and they don't know what to do with it because there's no track record to know like how to really deal with this. And so that's why it's a super, super big deal. So everyone always asks this question, well, what about temperature? Temperatures are going up. Isn't temperature the problem with the snow? And the answer is nit. So here is a not dusty year. And here's how much earlier the snow is going to melt with the dust. It's 28 days. With the temperature, here's some different temperature lines. It's about 8 days, 15 days, depending on how far up you want to have that temperature go. In a really dusty year, here's temperature. It's 6 degrees, it's this day. At 13 degrees, it's this day. But look at what the dust will do. It's going to do it 50 days. So yeah, temperature matters, but temperature's like totally no big deal compared to what the dust can do. It's, at most, the temperature is going to accelerate 5 to 15 days, but the dust can go up to 50. So it's very much the driver of this. So where does dust come from? This is very good. You get a cookie. Okay, you get 2. So this is a real problem because, of course, you've got this regional water supply. So we've modeled this probably 5 to 10% every year less water is entering the Colorado River. That's a lot. That's like all the water we promised Mexico. That's like 2 times what Las Vegas uses. I mean, this is a really big deal, especially as we're watching the Colorado River supplies go down, down, down. And so really, really big deal. And at some point, someone's going to go, you're losing my water because of your recreation, energy, cattle, whatever. But the interesting sociological experiment here is the problems being created in the upper basin. The sufferers, unless you're a skier, is in the lower basin. So who pays? Are we going to give out like dust credits like we have carbon credits? Like keep your cows home, keep your ORV home, we'll give you money so you don't make dust. It's a really interesting problem of what do we do about this. The other thing that's really interesting and depressing is that the best not dust years are the wetter years. And it's not the rainfall that's keeping down the dust, it's the invasive plants like bromus. So there we have it. They're the best defense we have is tumbleweeds and bromus. Woohoo! So that's not great news. But the problem is because we're disturbing these areas And so when it's a wet year, these annuals are germinating and they're stabilizing that which would blow because we basically nuked the soil crust, so they're not there anymore. So we're now dependent on these invasives to keep everything friendly. So anyway, so we said, okay, let's pretend like, this day's here and somebody wants to know where the dust is coming from. Let's see what we can do. Well, this is harder than you'd think. It can be vehicles, on those roads, or whatever. It can be, and that would be recreationists. It could be the livestock. It could be, a bunch of different things. Livestock, though, don't use landscapes evenly. It's really hard to measure that. So what we did instead, we put a ton of dust traps out around Moab. So we had like 100 of them out for 10 years. And we went and emptied them all the time. And we had them in very heavily grazed areas around water holes. We had them in, sort of the normal kind of grazed area. We had them on all these different soil types. And then we had them along roads. And we said, okay, the roads are the one thing we can measure. So we can maybe subtract out, what the other uses are doing if we can just get the roads out of there, because roads could be a really big deal. And so, ta-da! The interesting thing is roads are a huge source of dust, 61% times what comes off of a normal rangeland, but there aren't that many roads. And so overall, they're like 7% of the dust. That's a very conservative number, because you know how you can watch a dirt road and the dust cloud will just move down it? Well, we have the traps on perpendicular. So we want to make, that it's leaving, because if it's going down it might just fall right back on it. So this is a super conservative number, but it gives us a ballpark that, maybe they're 10%. But really, the problem is the use, that really much more diffuse use that's going on these landscapes, which is going to be extremely hard to get at. But, and around the watering holes, we had 12 times more dust. That's not surprising. There's no vegetation or anything. But they, too, are very, very limited spatially, because they're like watering holes once, in every square mile we got one. And it's only like an acre. So very, very limited amount. So that's an interesting thing. I don't know what to do with it, but there it is. Air pollution, actually, they love it. Crust think air pollution is the greatest thing since sliced bread, because what comes out of there is nitrogen. They don't have to fix it. They get it for free. And so they're like, yes! So we're not real concerned about them in terms of crust health. What we are concerned about is climate change. They hate hot temperatures. Now, that's not the guys that are living in the Sonoran. These are the guys living here. And these guys here want it cooler. And when you make it hotter, our lichens just tank. This is how they did with temperature, and these years were hotter and hotter and hotter, and it was just not a good story. The mosses didn't really care. They were kind of, responding to temperature and precip, but they'd come back if you had a nice, wet, cool year. And then we have other kinds of lichens that were all over the map too, and they didn't seem, but this lichen is our most important one. It's the one that fixes the most nitrogen. It's the most ubiquitous, so it's our guy that's the best stabilizer. He is our kind of gopher guy, and we're losing him big time. So lichens don't move that fast. They're not like seeds that blow forever. So it's not saying that these soils won't get something else eventually, but we have no idea what kind of time frame we're talking about at all. Okay, so everyone says, well, how fast do they recover? Depends on what you're talking about. So if you are in a hyper-arid desert, you're never going to get past here. You're going to get large cyano, small cyano, and a little bit of mosses and lichens in tiny little microsites, like super sheltered north slope places, things like that. If you're in a hot desert like the Sonoran, you're going to get up to these mid-successional lichens. If you're in a desert like the Colorado Plateau, then you're going to get this wonderful complement of tons of different species of lichens and mosses. And before I forget, I should say, if you want to find plant diversity in these communities, don't look at the plants. The biodiversity is in the soil crust. These guys womp butt when it comes to the biodiversity of a site in the desert. Anyway, so you need to know what your goal is. When you say it's recovered or not, Are you going to stop here, even if you're in a cool desert? When you say, okay, you know, it's recovered, are you going to stop? You want them all back? Because that's really going to determine when you say it's going to recover or not. So, before you look at these numbers and believe these are wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. And I just put them up here for the relativeness of the different components and the different deserts. But all we can do is go to a spot with my little quadrat frame, and I'm in Patton's tank tracks. So we've done a lot of work in those because they're really old. And I see, you know, what's recovered, and I go right next to it and I see what's over there. And I go, oh, okay. Well, if it recovered in a linear way, you know, this is how long it should take. Well, they don't recover in a linear way. Not at all. As soon as you get a propagule in, then they spread out a lot faster. So this is a linear estimation, therefore it's way wrong. But at least it helps us kind of think about the relative difference between the different deserts and the difference between the different components. But do not believe the numbers, pretty please, with gumdrops on top. Say what? Years. Yeah. But don't believe them. But you know, the point is that things are going to happen slower in drier places, and that's because these guys are only metabolically active when they're wet. So if it's drier, they're going to recover slower. If it's a drier year, they'll recover slower than a wetter year before. So it's hugely, the context is huge. And if it's a very unstable surface that's having sand blow in all the time, they're not going to get any better because they're going to get buried. So it's, but the other news is, even if these numbers are wrong, it's a long time if you're in a dry desert. That's going to take a way long time. So, I mean, that's like longer than we can even think about, right? So, based on this, we're like, what are we going to do? We have to do something. So, how do we enhance the recovery has been a focus of a lot of people's effort for a bunch of years. One is the obvious thing is reduce disturbance. Oh, I forgot to tell you about in dust too. We're watching all the grasses die off on the Colorado Plateau. They're really, really tanking with the higher temperatures. They're not going to be around, sorry, like in 20 or 30 years in any, to the degree they're out there now. And we're seeing this from our long-term monitoring. We have warming lamps out, so we're artificially increasing temperature. And we have rainfall shelters out where we're taking away rainfall and seeing what's happening, and they're really struggling.
Including cheatgrass?
No. Yes. Yes and no. The question was including cheatgrass. Yeah, cheatgrass, but now it's coming red brome from the Mojave. So it's a more drought-adapted version of the same guy. It's bromus, it's just a different one. Ours is really at its southern range extension, so it doesn't like hot years, and it doesn't germinate, and it doesn't grow. In a wet, cool year, it'll be right back, but the red brome's moving in for sure. So anyway, but the point is that means we need these soil crusts even more because grasses are the best stabilizers we've got. And they're kind of exiting stage right. So, like, I meant to say that and I forgot. Anyway, so back to enhancing recovery, and this is why it reminded me, is plant cover. Because plant cover slows the wind down. And so if you want to recover a site, you're not just wanting to put out biocrusts, you also want to put out plants and get the plants going. And so that's what reminded me. But also, you just don't disturb them in the first place. Duh, that would be the easiest. And then we've been exploring this, the inoculation and the fertilization. Inoculation, we're taking material from somewhere and bringing it into the place that needs recovery. Fertilization's kind of that double-edged sword again, because guess what cheatgrass and the other nasties love? They love nitrogen and phosphorus, so we're kind of like, okay, that's kind of scary. So we've been growing these guys in the greenhouse, having great success at growing them gangbusters in 4 months. We went from this little tiny little pieces to a full covered dish. Awesome. The only problem is when we put them out, they all die. But hey, we can grow them fast. You know, we're like, that's the first hurdle. Now we got to figure out what we're doing. So is it like a plant that you have to harden it off? Is it, who knows? There's all sorts of possibilities. And we're tackling that right now because we got the first stage down. Now we just have to figure out what we did wrong. the Chinese, for years, have been growing cyanobacteria in these giant raceways. They keep them wet the whole time, squirt them out along roadsides in phenomenal success. The problem with us is we are trying to dry them down because we need to go over 250 million hectares of western rangelands. Those aren't all by a road. And we need them dry and light because I want to put them in the belly of like those airplanes that spray out fire retardant and aren't doing anything all winter. You know, I want to get them in the bellies and spray them everywhere, but they don't. So we got to figure out how to wake them back up because we dry them down. When you do it this way, then they're awake, they work great. In Iceland, they decided, so Iceland has rock storms. This is a real problem. It buries cars, it kills people, and like fills up their houses with rocks. Bad, juju. These are just pumice stones, right? They're like incredibly light and they blow. So these guys have been trying all these different rehab things. Basically, they fill up airplanes with seed and fertilizer and they fly over, and for 2 years they get this wonderful lush patch. But then, of course, there's no soil. It's just rocks. And so the nutrients leach down, everything dies, and then, you know, this is the next year, and then the next year is right there. But guess what that is? That is this gorgeous mat of mosses and lichens. And I'm like, guys, just get rid of the plant seed. Just go fly fertilizer everywhere, because they brought me over wanting to know how to stabilize this place. I was like, forget the plant seed. And they're like, no, you don't understand. We want to graze it, which is how it got like that. And I was like, no, you don't understand. Because they literally lost about 20 feet of soil. So there was about 20 feet of soil on top of this black rocks that they kind of lost. So this is the most literate, richest per capita country on Earth. These same people moved to the outer ring of the island, and they're doing the same thing again. And they're saying it's climate change. So it's really hard for us to learn. I'm not pointing at them because they make the best chocolate in the whole world. Literally, I mean it. But, you know, it's really hard for us to get in our brains that something we've done for thousands of years isn't going to work anymore. So that's it. Yes, and we have plenty of time for questions. So where's my microphone? Oh, no, there. Their microphone. Not my microphone.
Okay, we got questions. We got lots of time.
Antarctica, is there any dust in Antarctica?
Yes.
Yes. It's just when you said, had I seen it, and do you see it? Antarctica, most of the dust that can blow has blown. And so what there is really coarse soils that we would actually call rocks. They blow. No problem, because there's no... From there, yeah. It comes from Australia. Not that we know of. No, not that we know of. The winds don't go the right way. But definitely from Australia.
And on one of your slides, you showed the percentage of where the dust comes from, and you had rangeland at the top and then down below grazing. What is the difference between rangeland and grazing?
It wasn't. It's the same. Wait, that one? So this is the heavy grazing. So these are those water holes. So this isn't normal, so this is just that diffuse, cows are out, sheep are out eating things, energy trucks are driving around, recreationists are driving or biking around, walking around. So this is every kind of use that's happening on the rangelands. Everything. This is those water holes only. So it's this area right around, one every square mile, you've got about an acre of just nukeness, and that's what they're producing. Stun them into silence.
So recreation use is definitely increasing, right?
Way.
But do you think that so BLM's the largest landowner in the West, right? Do you think BLM switching to designated route systems is helping?
Oh, serious. It's the best thing ever. This is like an answer to all prayers. The only thing is now we need them to be willing, not them, the public, to be willing to close some of the roads because they try and the public screams and yells and it doesn't happen. We have 6,000 miles of dirt roads, not even gravel roads, dirt roads in San Juan County. You know, that little tiny portion of Utah alone. And most of them don't go anywhere, and they're even redundant. They'll like parallel each other. But we're having a terrible, terrible time getting any of them shut down. And the management agencies have tried. It's not for lack of trying. But it's RS2477 if you know about that. So
Can I just ask one follow-up question? So when you do close those routes or roads, you talked about inoculating them with.
Yeah.
So would that just be like raking?
Yep,
Okay.
exactly. And that's what we do, like in the parks and things where we have more help per square inch. And rangers all have rakes in the back of their trucks. They see somebody going off the road, they just jump out and rake it out, and you won't know if it goes over a winter, you'll no longer know there was a track there. And it's not that it's recovered, it's just gotten bumpy, so it fakes them out, right? It looks bumpy, and so therefore it must be okay. RS2477 is a law that basically says any road that existed before 1970 something or other that goes somewhere and has a commercial purpose is owned by the states. And so, you know, when you've got all these roads out there, if they can prove that, then the counties have been declaring that they are open and that they are county roads, and therefore it makes them literally impossible to close. So that's kind of this debate. There's been like Capitol Reef has one going through the park. Park's going, neat, never went anywhere. You know, this is not your road. The county's going, oh, yes, it is. So it's created all sorts of chaos.
I have a really quick question. Looking at this photo makes me think about biochar, and I'm wondering, especially in this area, we've done the public agencies have done some experimenting with biochar to build soil.
Uh-huh.
Have you in the desert?
No, not at all. For no reason. Just not.
So speaking of roads, one of our biggest initiators of roads are fracking.
Is what?
Fracking.
Uh-huh.
So the infrastructure associated with fracking wells. Have you considered looking at the mileage of dirt roads, say up in the Piants and up in those counties
It's
up
huge.
in there?
And yeah, we have. It's humongous. And that actually brings up a really interesting thing because it's not, we could easily reduce so the roads, here's a well, here's a well, here's a well, here's a well, and here's a well. And the roads don't go like neat, 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 neat. They go neat, 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 neat. And so there really is opportunity to cut the roads down in these intense oil places. It's going to be more expensive because therefore people have to drive further. And actually it would be interesting to do the cost benefit because if you're driving further, so I should say dust production is linearly related with the weight of the vehicle and the sluggedness of the tires and how fast people are driving. So you got these big, huge, heavy oil trucks. If they have to go twice as far, it might not be a benefit to reduce the mileage of the roads, but I kind of think it probably would be, just because a lot of it is pickup trucks. They don't make that much, and the road just sitting there makes dust. So, but it would be a really interesting exercise to see, you know, like actually, but the one great management technique in there is don't straighten the road. Leave the curves, leave the dips, and then everyone's going to have to drive slowly, and we'll have way less dust than we do. Because we go in there, we put in big culverts, we straighten those roads, and people are like, bing, and that's kind of making a real lot of dust.
So you said 93%, something like that, is not roads.
Right.
It's a lot of grazing and
Recreation.
stuff like that. So
Yeah.
with grazing, how did you compare like the cattle with like a natural ungulate or
We didn't.
wildlife?
No. We just did roads and subtracted. We said, okay, here's the total amount of dust that's ending up in the snow. Here's the total amount of dust we're getting off our roads. Therefore, the rest of it must be coming from diffuse use, because we have no good way to separate out recreationists and livestock and oil trucks and all this stuff. It's just like really hard.
Okay.
And I don't know how anyone's going to do it.
So you don't have any way to compare like a natural grazer to a human grazer?
Well, yeah.
A
Well,
cow.
I mean, yes and no. Don't forget this is a desert. There's hardly any wildlife out there because there's no water. And so it's not, especially before we told all the ranchers to put water out every square mile, there was like Zippo on the surface water. So we have deer herds and things using these areas now, but they only come down in the winter. The soils are frozen. There's generally snow on the ground. It's not really a big deal for the native grazers. And we've never had large herds here. That's not ever, that was kind of the Midwest thing, short grass steppe, like Fort Collins on. So it's, we never had that kind of use, and we really still don't have much except in the winter. So the native ungulates is pretty easy to get at. Not here, obviously.
Back here. Would you mind sharing a bit about your life or characteristics as a scientist? It's fascinating to me that you are so knowledgeable about something that, all of humanity walks and looks at soil, and you know all this about it, and it's just fascinating. When did you first start wondering about it?
I have two great examples. One is years and years ago, I had a review of my science, and the Big Cheese regional director said, "Why would anyone care about what you're doing?" And I was just like, because I'd just given him this talk. I'm like, oh no, I didn't convince him. But it was all my major professor in graduate school. It's all his fault. I've realized it was a diabolical plot because the political environment was getting too hot, studying these guys and going, we can't walk anywhere, we can't read it. And he's like, I'm out of here, I'm going to do rare plants. You do this. So it was all his fault. But he introduced them to me, and they were just so cute. And I mean that. I was like, oh man, these are so cute. I can't even remember his name, thank goodness. But I was just like, what? Who was your professor? Kimball Harper from Brigham Young, and he was just the most awesome human on the planet. But awesome. Oh, no, totally the opposite. The guy was incredible. And boy, did he know. I mean, I know nothing compared to that guy. He just extraordinary brain. But the big thing really was he handed this, so no one knew anything about them. They just knew who they were. They had no idea what they did. They had no idea if they were important. Nobody had done that. They'd just done the taxonomy to decide what was a species and what wasn't. And so he's like, we really need to know about these guys. And he had done a very preliminary study where he went to outside of Mac. There are some watersheds there that they put in instruments in 1950 and measured grazed and ungrazed, paired the sediment and runoff coming off of those, and found there was no change in the vegetation, but in the grazed, boosh, you had like double the water coming off, and you had way more sediment coming off than the ungrazed, and it was the soil crust. So that's got his interest going. He took one look and went, oh, these guys are so cool, you do it. So, because he saw that word grazing, I just know it, that this was like a plot. He didn't want to take all the flack. But yeah, so that was it.
That's awesome. We collectively, I think we have a question over here. I'm curious about agencies using the data to make management decisions, and if it actually gets used. There's a lot of science in the world that doesn't ever get used, and Miles has a complementary question.
Yeah, and so it's hard to identify point sources, right? But from your gut feeling, what is the number one change we can make to public land management?
I was going to answer something else. Because we can use remote sensing to detect the really big constant sources, and they're not that, big dust producers, but they're not that big. So we actually have the ability, using Dust Bowl technology, to go in and stabilize them, and we'll probably get rid of the vast majority of the dust. So that's the other part to this story, is that we've got these areas that are just mega producers. And it's mostly because of the soil texture. So we need to go in and stabilize those areas. And that's the one thing land management one thing that land managers can do is like find out where they are and go in and stabilize them. It's probably going to need physical structures like snow fences, because we don't have trees like they did in Oklahoma. But that's one thing for sure that we just need to do, is stop these really big sources from producing. There's no interest. I've tried and tried and tried, and everyone's just so overworked and so overwhelmed with the fires on the desk. The idea of like doing something that's going to be a problem in 20 years, you know, it's just really hard. And it's nobody in the agency's fault. I mean, really, I'm so sympathetic with the BLM, and I'm so glad I don't work for them. Because they have to please everyone, and they can't, and they have no money, they have no resources, they're overworked. They've now been basically told they have to get all their oil and gas permits out before they do anything else. I mean, it's just like, yeah. So, but that's the one thing I would just love, if I had a wish list, would be to let's just identify these big sources and go get them. And then we're already halfway to the problem solved.
Thank you all for being here tonight and for being part of this whole winter. And thanks to Jayne. This is awesome.